The cub kept looking back, as if leading him straight into danger. A baby lion collapsed at Ethan's feet, begging him to follow. He didn't know where it would lead him, only that something was terribly wrong. Each step pulled him deeper into danger, through deserts, predators, and a dying mother waiting in the dark. But he kept going, because the cub never stopped asking for help. The morning sun had just begun to lift over the Namibian savanna when Ethan Walker steered his dusty utility truck along the narrow dirt track that cut through the open grasslands. He had driven this path hundreds of times, enough to recognize every crooked acacia tree and every bend where the wind pushed sand across the road overnight. Today felt no different at first glance. The quiet shimmer of dawn, the hum of the engine, the warm breeze threading through the cracked window. Ethan let his eyes linger on the horizon, where gold brushed against pale blue. The kind of morning light that always reminded him why he chose this life far away from busy cities and crowded highways. Out here, time breathed slower. But the calm broke in a heartbeat. A blur of pale gold shot out of the tall grass and into the path of his truck. Ethan's foot slammed onto the brakes before his mind could process what he had seen. The tires skidded violently, kicking up a storm of red dust that swallowed the hood of the truck. For a moment, everything went silent. No engine, no wind, just the sound of his own breath catching in his throat. Ethan threw the truck into park and leaned forward, gripping the wheel. Dust drifted aside just enough for him to see a small shape trembling in the middle of the road. A lion cub, barely the size of a medium dog, stood frozen in the haze, its fur sticking to its sides as though it had been running far longer than its small body could afford. Its legs quivered beneath it, and its breaths came in short, panicked bursts. Before Ethan could even open the door, the cub let out a soft, broken cry, too weak to be a roar, too desperate to be anything but a plea. He stepped out slowly, keeping his movements steady. In all the years he had filmed and studied wildlife, lion cubs this young never traveled alone, never approached humans, never begged, unless something unimaginable had happened. Ethan raised his hands slightly to show he meant no harm. The cub didn't bolt. It didn't growl. Instead, it limped toward him on unsteady legs. "Easy. Easy now," Ethan murmured, his voice barely above a whisper. The cub reached him and pressed its small paws against his pant leg, standing on its hind legs as if trying to climb him, its tiny claws barely gripping the fabric. Ethan froze. The cub's fur was warm but trembling, its heartbeat rapid against his shin. It tilted its head up toward him, eyes wide and glassy, carrying exhaustion and fear. The kind of fear young animals only feel when they've been separated from the one thing that keeps them alive. "Where's your mother?" he whispered, though he already feared the answer. A lioness would never allow her cub to stray far. For a baby this small to approach a human meant the mother couldn't come. Something had stopped her, something violent or tragic. The cub made another sound, a faint rasping cry, and nuzzled Ethan's leg, as if urging him to move. Ethan crouched down, his knees brushing the dirt, and gently placed a hand on its back. The cub flinched at first, then leaned into his palm, breath shuddering. Up close, Ethan could see dust tangled in its whiskers, a small scrape near its flank, and the way its ribs rose and fell quickly from exhaustion. "Okay," he said softly. "You're trying to tell me something, aren't you?" He glanced around the silent savanna. No movement. No lioness emerging from the grass. No rustling of a hidden pride. Only the rising wind and the cold. Understanding that the cub was truly alone, Ethan stood and turned slowly in a full circle, scanning for tracks, listening for the distant rumble of other animals. Nothing. Not even the familiar echo of vultures. The emptiness around them felt wrong. The cub tugged at his pants again, claws barely scraping the fabric, then stepped away a few feet, looking back at him with urgency. It wasn't running blindly. It was asking him to follow. Ethan wiped the dust from his hands, his heartbeat steady but heavy. As a wildlife photographer, he was trained to observe, not interfere. But this wasn't a moment for rules or distance. This was a living creature crying for help in the most human way it knew how. He took one step toward the cub. It immediately perked up, tail twitching, and took a few more steps ahead before stopping again to make sure Ethan was behind it. That tiny confirmation, that flicker of trust, pulled at something deep in his chest. "All right," he said, locking his truck and slinging his small field pack over his shoulder. "I'm coming. Show me." The cub turned and trotted toward the tall grass, its movements still shaky but filled with purpose. Ethan followed closely behind, each step pulling him farther away from the safety of the road and deeper into the unknown, where something unseen and possibly terrible waited. He didn't know what he would find. He only knew one thing with absolute certainty. This journey had already begun the moment the baby lion begged him for help. The cub darted ahead through a patch of tall grass, its small frame weaving between the golden blades, as if following a path only it could sense. Ethan stayed close behind, careful not to lose sight of the flicking tail and faint impressions it left in the dust. The early morning warmth had begun to sink into the air, carrying that dry, familiar smell of the savanna, sun-baked earth, brittle grass, and the distant hint of something he couldn't quite identify. It wasn't danger, not yet, but something unsettled, something that didn't belong in a morning as calm as this one was supposed to be. Ethan tightened the straps on his pack as he walked, listening for any sound that didn't fit the usual rhythm of the wild. He knew enough to trust his instincts, and right now those instincts told him that whatever lay ahead wasn't going to be simple. The cub suddenly stopped and turned back, its wide amber eyes locking onto Ethan with an urgency that struck deep. It let out a short, high-pitched cry, as if checking whether he was still there. Ethan nodded gently, even though the cub couldn't understand the gesture itself. Somehow, it understood the intent. Its small ears some hours twitched, and then it continued forward, never too far, never too fast. A pace that almost felt intentional, like the cub was making sure he could keep up. Ethan found that strange. Most wild cubs acted out of panic, darting without direction. But this one moved with purpose, pausing only to make sure he followed. There was no randomness in its steps. His boot brushed against a patch of disturbed soil. He crouched down and brushed the dirt aside with the back of his hand. The soil hadn't just been stepped on, it had been torn. He saw faint drag marks, almost erased by the wind. Something heavy had moved through here, something perhaps struggling. A knot tightened in his chest. The cub waited a few yards ahead, pawing at the ground as though calling him to hurry. Ethan stood, brushed the dust off his palms, and kept moving. He reached for his radio instinctively and pressed the call button. "Field unit to base, are you copy?" Static crackled through the speaker, nothing else. He tried again. "Base, this is Walker. I've encountered a lion cub. It's alone and appears distressed. I'm heading north, requesting confirmation." More static. No voice. No signal. He let out a slow breath and clipped the radio back onto his belt. Out here, in this stretch of open land, blind spots were common. But he had hoped, at the very least, for faint communication. The silence made him uneasy. He couldn't call for backup, couldn't request a vet team, couldn't even alert anyone to where he was headed. He was on his own. The cub veered suddenly to the right, slipping between low shrubs. Ethan followed and found himself entering a more rugged part of the terrain, where old termite mounds rose like silent sentinels and thorn bushes sprawled across the ground in tangled mats. The cub paused near one mound, sniffing at the dirt and letting out a low, pained whimper. Ethan moved closer and noticed a tuft of lion fur snagged on a thorn. A larger tuft, softer, clearly from an adult lioness. His heart sank. He scanned the vegetation and spotted a few more signs. Crushed grass, disturbed earth, and a faint trail that something had been dragged across. Something happened here, he muttered under his breath. The cub nudged his boot as if urging him on, its tiny breaths quick and unsteady. Ethan knelt beside it. I know you're scared, he whispered, though he didn't fully understand why he said it. Maybe because speaking out loud grounded him, made the unfolding tension a little less heavy. The cub nudged him again, this time with more insistence, then trotted ahead. Ethan rose to his feet and followed. The landscape opened slightly into a long sweep of grassland stretching toward the horizon. The sun had climbed higher, warming his neck and casting sharp shadows across the ground. The cub moved in small bursts now, run a little, look back, wait, then repeat. It was as if the little lion was torn between instinctive fear and the fragile trust it had placed in Ethan. Every time he caught up, the cub pressed close to his leg before continuing again. It was a strange partnership, formed out of circumstance rather than choice, yet somehow completely natural in this moment. A faint breeze carried a sound, something distant, barely noticeable. Ethan stopped and listened, head tilted. The cub froze too, ears perked, body trembling. The sound faded quickly, swallowed by the wind, but Ethan felt a shiver along his spine. It had been low, guttural, almost like a pained groan. He couldn't be sure. The savanna could play tricks with distance, but the cub's reaction was all the confirmation he needed. Your mother's out there, Ethan whispered. The cub looked back as if it knew. They climbed a small rise where the soil was more compact, and as Ethan reached the top, he saw something that made him stop cold. Faint impressions in the dirt. Fresh tracks of an adult lioness. But they weren't normal walking prints. They were uneven, scattered, some pressed deeper than others as though the lioness had stumbled. Nearby he found a few drops of dried blood, already darkening under the sun. It wasn't much, but it was enough to push his senses into full alert. The cub approached the prints, sniffed them, and recoiled with a pitiful cry that echoed more like heartbreak than fear. Ethan knelt again and studied the tracks. Whatever had happened, it wasn't long ago. The trail led further north, toward a line of thicker shrubs. The cub tugged at Ethan's pant leg, pulling in that same direction. You want me to follow her trail? Ethan murmured. He stood up. All right. The cub darted ahead, its little paws kicking dust behind it, but stopped before reaching the shrubs, looking back anxiously. Ethan walked toward it, his steps slow, cautious. The air had grown still, heavy with the tension of something unseen. Every instinct he had learned over decades in the field told him they were walking into the aftermath of a confrontation, something violent. As they crossed into the denser brush, the temperature dropped slightly, shadows pooling beneath the branches. Ethan pushed branches aside and stepped through, careful not to startle the cub. It followed close, brushing occasionally against his ankle. The ground here bore deeper disruptions, claw marks, gouges in the soil, patches of fur, and more scattered droplets of dried blood. The air even smelled different, musky, unsettled, tinged with the faint scent of fear that animals leave behind after fleeing danger. Then, for the first time, Ethan hesitated, not because he doubted the cub or the trail, but because he understood more clearly now the gravity of what they were walking into. This wasn't a simple case of a mother and cub separated. Something had attacked the lioness, or forced her into a dangerous situation, and she had fled, injured. Ethan looked down at the cub, whose small chest rose and fell rapidly. I'm not leaving you, he said quietly. We'll find her. The cub blinked slowly, as if it understood more than he expected. They moved forward together. The brush suddenly thinned, revealing a slanted patch of earth ahead where the tracks became even more erratic. The lioness had stumbled here, perhaps fallen. Ethan's pulse quickened. They were getting closer. He could feel it. But he could also feel something else. An unspoken warning settling in the air. A shift that made the back of his neck tighten. Whatever had happened wasn't finished. The signs told him that clearly. Ethan took a steady breath and followed the cub deeper into the unknown, the weight of the savanna pressing down on them like a silent witness. The brush ahead thickened into a narrow corridor of thorny branches and scattered shrubs, the kind of place where animals moved quietly and danger nestled easily in shadow. Ethan pushed through the tangled growth, his shoulders brushing against stiff branches that crackled softly. The cub slipped through first, small enough to weave between the thorns without slowing. Ethan stayed close behind, his boots pressing into dirt that no longer looked untouched. The soil bore the marks of struggle, uneven patches where something larger had skidded or tried to regain footing. The cub paused, nose to the ground, letting out a trembling sound that made Ethan's stomach tighten. He knelt and touched the soil with careful fingers. It was still loose, not yet hardened by the sun. Whatever happened here, happened recently. He brushed aside a clump of grass and spotted faint streaks of dried blood leading forward, hidden beneath flattened blades. He felt his breath shorten. Lions bled in fights, but this wasn't the pattern of a territorial clash. This was the trail of an animal trying to escape something. The cub stepped beside him and pressed its little head into his hand, as if needing reassurance. He offered a gentle rub behind its ear before standing again. The wind shifted, carrying a new smell, sharp, chemical, almost metallic. Ethan's eyes narrowed. He knew that scent. Tranquilizer residue. He had smelled it before on poaching sites where dart guns were used to immobilize adult animals. His jaw tightened. That meant humans had been here, recently, and carelessly. A sick weight formed in his chest, something colder than fear and heavier than frustration. If poachers had targeted the lioness, she wouldn't have been able to protect her cub at all. The cub trotted ahead again, its small paws tapping lightly over the disturbed earth. Ethan followed slowly, scanning every inch of ground and brush for clues. A torn patch of lion fur clung to a low branch, pale and plush, clearly from an adult. He reached up and plucked it free carefully. The cub sniffed it, then whimpered, shrinking under the weight of its own fear. Ethan closed his hand around the fur, feeling the chill of realization sink deeper. They descended into a shallow ravine where grass grew in uneven tufts along the slopes. The area felt unusually silent, as though the savanna itself was holding its breath. Ethan noticed more drag marks here, deeper and more defined. His mind began assembling the pieces. The lioness had been darted, stumbled, then tried to flee while semi-conscious. The cub cried out softly and pawed the drag trail, its claws scraping the hardened edge. Ethan crouched and examined the pattern again. There were two sets of tracks, one lioness, one cub, running parallel for a short distance before separating. The cub had been following her until it physically couldn't keep up. "You chased her as far as you could, didn't you?" Ethan whispered, his voice cracking just slightly. The cub looked up at him with eyes that understood loss more deeply than any young creature should. He kept moving, letting the cub take the lead, though its tiny body trembled with each step. They climbed out of the ravine and entered a more open patch of land where wind tugged at the grass, bending it in sweeping motions. The trail grew more chaotic here, as if confusion or panic had set in. Ethan found deep impressions where the lioness had fallen to her side, then claw marks where she pushed herself upright again. Nearby, the ground bore a faint imprint of something foreign. Boot tracks, half erased by wind but still visible to a trained eye. He froze, staring at them. Boots, human boots, his stomach twisted. Poachers often moved fast and silently. If they were nearby, he and the cub were in danger, just as much as the lioness had been. He scanned the horizon but saw no movement, no flicker of shadow. Still, the presence of boot tracks meant one thing. Whatever had injured the lioness wasn't over. Whoever had fired the dart might still be on the move. Ethan instantly shifted his stance, placing himself slightly ahead of the cub in a protective reflex he didn't have time to question. They continued, slow and deliberate, until the boot prints veered off toward the northeast. The lioness's trail, however, angled more sharply north. Ethan sighed with relief when he saw the paths diverge. The poachers must have followed her until she fled too far or too deeply into thicker brush where carrying her would be too difficult. He prayed they had given up, but the cub's trail told him the lioness had not escaped unscathed. He reached a cluster of thorn bushes and pulled them apart. Behind the first row of branches, the soil was torn in several wide arcs, as if a large body had stumbled repeatedly. The cub squeezed past him, sniffed the ground, then backed away with a low cry. Ethan saw it then. Another streak of dried blood, larger this time, smeared across a patch of flattened grass. He followed it with his eyes until the smear disappeared into more brush. His chest felt tight. "She's hurt," he murmured, barely able to hear his own voice over the pounding in his ears. "Badly." The cub nudged his leg again, not to ask for comfort this time, but to push him forward. Ethan nodded. They stepped deeper into the brush, emerging on the other side into a small clearing framed by crooked trees. Here, the trail became erratic. The lioness had circled, stumbled, maybe even collapsed briefly. Ethan kneeled near a patch of disturbed soil and noticed small indentations, tiny paw prints overlapping larger ones. The cub had reached her here. The prints told the story. The cub had pressed against its mother, perhaps crying out for her to rise, to keep moving. The idea wrenched at Ethan's chest. He touched the tiny print gently. "You tried to keep her going," he whispered. The cub let out a fragile sound that answered him. Ethan stood and looked ahead. The trail continued, but it grew faint, disappearing into shadows cast by a gathering of gnarled acacias. The air carried a strange stillness, one that made Ethan acutely aware of every heartbeat and breath. Something deeper waited up ahead, something final. He tightened the straps of his pack once more and let his hand hover near the cub's back. The little lion pressed closer to him, as though steeling itself for whatever lay beyond the next line of trees. Together, they stepped into the shadows, following the last trembling traces of a mother's desperate struggle. The trees soon thinned again, giving way to an unexpected drop in the land. Ethan found himself standing at the top of a narrow ridge overlooking a deep cut through the earth. The ravine stretched like a jagged scar across the savanna, a long strip carved by centuries of stolen rainwater and violent flash floods. The locals called it Devil's Wash, a place where even strong animals often misjudged their footing. And at the bottom of that ravine, a stream churned in a restless brown swirl of water, fed by distant rains. The cub stopped at the edge and whimpered softly, pacing back and forth as if searching for a way around. Ethan scanned both directions. The ravine zigzagged far beyond sight, its walls steep and unforgiving. Taking the long way around would cost them hours, maybe an entire day. And the lioness's weakening trail made the truth painfully clear. They didn't have that kind of time. Ethan rubbed the back of his neck, feeling the heat of the sun settle there as he surveyed the water below. Swift, uneven currents, sudden drop-offs, strong underpulls. And to make matters worse, on the opposite bank, a line of wild dogs stood in the shade of acacia trees, watching. Painted wolves, lean, agile, and relentless when they sensed weakness. Ethan's pulse stuttered. The pack hadn't noticed them yet, but they were positioned exactly where he needed to go. He knelt beside the cub. "We're not going down there," he whispered, glancing at the swirling water. "Not yet." But the cub pressed its small head against his hand and shook faintly, as though urging him onward. It sniffed at the ground, then stared straight across the ravine where the tracks picked up clearly on the opposite bank. The lioness had made it across somehow, or had been forced. Ethan stepped back from the rim and studied the slope descending toward the water. Loose soil, scattered roots, a dangerous angle. One slip and the rush would take them. He swallowed hard and followed the cub a few steps along the ridge, scanning again for any natural crossing point. Nothing. No fallen logs, no narrow stony bridge, no shallow bend. Just the rushing cut of Devil's Wash and the painful knowledge that turning back wasn't an option. A gust of wind blew dust into his eyes. He blinked against it and squinted toward the painted wolves. They waited still, listening to something Ethan couldn't hear. If he descended too slowly, or if the cub made noise, they would surely notice. He needed a plan, one that involved speed and minimal splashing. His gaze swept their surroundings until he spotted a cluster of exposed roots hanging down the ravine wall like a makeshift rope. Not perfect, not even safe, but enough. He crouched beside the cub again and placed his hands gently on its sides. "I'll carry you," he said. "You're too small to make this climb on your own." The cub's ears flicked, and its trembling eased just a bit. Ethan slipped the pack off his shoulders and adjusted the straps so he could carry it in one hand while holding the cub in the other. Then he scooped the little lion into his arms. The cub tensed, then nestled against his chest, its tiny claws hooking into the fabric of his shirt for balance. Ethan approached the edge again and took a steadying breath. "All right," he whispered to himself. "One step at a time." He placed his boot onto the slanted dirt slope and felt it shift slightly under his weight. Slowly, he began the descent. The cub clung to him, its heartbeat rapid against his chest. Ethan angled his body sideways, pressing into the earth to maintain traction. Dust slid beneath his boots, crumbling into the ravine with soft, pattering sounds. Each step required precision. One wrong shift, and the slope would collapse beneath him. He focused on the roots ahead, visualizing every grip and step needed to cross safely. Halfway down, the painted wolves noticed him. A rustle of movement drew his gaze upward. The alpha, a tall male with mottled fur and sharp amber eyes, stepped into the sunlight. It tilted its head slightly, analyzing him. Ethan froze. His breath caught in his throat. The cub burrowed deeper into his chest. For a long moment, nothing moved, not even the grass in the wind. Then, perhaps deciding he wasn't prey or wasn't worth the distance, the alpha turned and paced back into the shade. The others followed, though their attention lingered. Ethan didn't waste time. He reached the dangling roots and wrapped one arm around them, securing the cub with the other. The water gushed below, slapping against rocks and tugging at debris. The sound alone could shake a person's nerve. Ethan closed his eyes for half a second and took a grounding breath before lowering himself fully down the final slope. His boots hit the shallow bank with a splash, cold water soaking through his socks instantly. The current was stronger than expected. It pulled at his legs, trying to drag him off balance. He clenched his jaw and shifted his weight forward. "Just hold on," he whispered to the cub. He stepped into the flow. Water surged around his thighs, then his waist, pressing like a heavy animal pushing from the side. Each step felt like wrestling against invisible hands. He planted his boots carefully onto the rocky bed beneath, searching blindly for footholds beneath the cloudy water. His legs trembled with effort, and his shoulders burned as he clung to the cub. Seconds stretched. 10, then 20. Time moved strangely in the water. He could hear nothing but the roar of the current and the pounding of his own heart. Midway across, The water surged higher, splashing against his chest. For a moment, the force nearly swept him sideways. He stumbled, his breath choking in his throat. The cub let out a frightened cry and tightened its grip on his shirt. "Not now," Ethan growled through clenched teeth. He lifted the cub higher and planted his feet firmly again. He pushed forward inch by inch, breath by breath. Finally, his boot struck the rising ground of the opposite bank. He lunged upward, climbing out of the current and collapsing onto the grass. The cub rolled onto his chest, wide-eyed, trembling but alive. Ethan lay there for a moment, chest heaving, letting the sun warm his cold, soaked clothes. He glanced back across the ravine and exhaled shakily. They had made it. Against every odd, they had made it. The cub nuzzled his chin. Ethan managed a weary smile. "You're tougher than you look," he murmured. But there was no time to linger. He sat up, adjusted his pack, and lifted the cub gently onto its paws. The little lion steadied itself, then looked toward the north where the tracks disappeared again into tall grass. Ethan followed its gaze and rose to his feet. They had crossed the Devil's Wash, but the real journey, the one the cub begged him to take, still stretched far ahead. "Lead the way," Ethan whispered. The cub took a cautious step, then another, and together they continued deeper into the vast, shimmering wilderness. The ground shifted gradually beneath their feet as the landscape stretched wider and flatter than before. The golden grass thinned, giving way to patches of sun-scorched earth. Ethan noticed how the cub's steps were becoming less steady, its small paws lifting slower, its tail dragging slightly behind. Exhaustion clung to the little creature like a shadow. Ethan slowed his pace to match the cub's, keeping close enough to catch it if its legs buckled. The sun, now high overhead, spilled harsh light over the land, turning the air into a shimmering curtain of heat. Ethan recognized the signs. Dehydration was setting in, and the cub hadn't eaten anything substantial in who knew how long. The wind picked up, carrying thin sheets of sand across the plain. Ethan shielded his eyes and glanced ahead. In the distance, a low stretch of land began to rise, a dune-like ridge where the sand swirled in restless spirals. It wasn't a real desert, not like the great dunes further west. But this patch of terrain had earned its name among field researchers: the desert graveyard. It was a place where bones surfaced and vanished beneath the shifting ground, a reminder of the brutal cycles of life for animals caught in storms, droughts, or fights they couldn't win. The cub continued forward but stumbled twice in a row, its little legs wobbling dangerously. Ethan moved closer, placing a steady hand near its side. "Easy," he murmured. "Just a little farther." The cub looked up at him, eyes glazed with fatigue, and let out a tiny, broken grunt. Ethan's heart twisted. They needed water. They needed food, and neither seemed anywhere near. As they reached the edge of the graveyard, the wind strengthened again, revealing the pale curve of a ribcage half buried in the sand. A few loose feathers scattered across the ground, remnants of a vulture's visit. Ethan scanned the area, alert for movement. Desert graveyard didn't always mean danger, but it often hosted scavengers, some harmless, some not. Today, the space appeared eerily quiet. He crouched beside the cub and offered a sip from his canteen. The cub lapped at the water desperately, tiny tongue scraping the metal rim. Ethan wished he had more to give, but his supply was limited and needed to stretch for both of them. When the cub finished, it pressed its forehead against Ethan's palm, as if thanking him for the small relief. They continued on, traversing the shifting sand. The cub's pace faltered again, its breath shallow and rapid. Ethan's gaze darted across the landscape, searching for any sign of food, tracks, carrion, or even signs of scavenger activity. Then he saw it. A kettle of vultures circling above a depression in the sand. Dozens of dark shapes wheeled slowly beneath the bright sun, their movements unhurried, confident. Where vultures hovered, there was always something dead. Ethan's pulse kicked up. He lifted the cub gently into his arms and headed toward the vultures. The heat radiating from the sand seemed to intensify with every step. The air shimmered, bending the horizon into fluid shapes. The cub lay quietly against his chest now, no longer protesting, its body limp with exhaustion. As Ethan crested a small rise, the scene below came into view. A young kudu, barely fully grown, lay collapsed in the sand. Its legs were folded awkwardly, and its body hadn't yet taken on the sour smell of decay. It looked like it had died recently, likely from dehydration or a broken leg sustained in a fall. Around the body, a ring of vultures stood perched, waiting for an opening to feed. Ethan set the cub down gently, then picked up a handful of small stones. "Stay close," he told the cub, though he doubted it had the strength to wander far. Ethan hurled the stones at the vultures, shouting to startle them. "Go on! Get!" His voice echoed across the barren stretch. The vultures hissed and flapped their wings, reluctant to leave but unwilling to challenge him directly. With several strong beats of their wings, they lifted into the air, circling overhead with irritated cries. Ethan approached the kudu cautiously. The carcass was intact, untouched except for a few superficial pecks from the birds. He knelt down and checked the body. No signs of disease, no strange discoloration. Safe enough for a starving cub. He waved at the little lion, who tottered weakly toward him. The cub hesitated beside the kudu, sniffing tentatively, as though unsure whether it had permission. Ethan gave a gentle nod. "It's all right. Eat." The cub looked at him once more before pressing its small teeth into the softer flesh of the kudu's flank. At first, it struggled, its jaw too weak for large tears, but hunger lent strength. Slowly, it managed to chew, lick, and swallow. Ethan watched, relief flowing through him as color returned to the cub's movements. He stayed beside it, keeping an eye on the vultures above them. They waited patiently, knowing their turn would come. Minutes passed. The cub ate until its energy steadied, then stepped away from the carcass and walked to Ethan, its face smeared with sand and pale traces of the kudu. It rubbed its small head against his knee, a gesture Ethan had seen among lion cubs bonding with their mothers. He reached down and stroked the top of its head, feeling a warmth in his chest stronger than the sun's heat around them. "You did good," he whispered. "You needed that." The wind softened at last, losing its sharp bite. With the cub now steadier on its feet, they turned away from the kudu. Ethan grabbed his pack and slung it over his shoulder. The vulture cries shifted as the birds descended again to claim what was left. But Ethan didn't look back. His eyes followed the faint prints leading north, the lioness's path, and he felt that familiar tug of urgency return. The cub pressed its body against his leg once more, ready to continue. Ethan set one foot forward, then another, and together they left the desert graveyard behind, both stronger than when they entered. And for the first time since the journey began, Ethan felt not just worry, but a flicker of hope. A small, stubborn hope. Hope that they were getting closer. Ethan felt that hope warming the edges of his thoughts as he and the cub moved northward, leaving the shifting sands of the desert graveyard behind. The terrain changed again, slowly rising and falling in gentle slopes. Scattered mopan trees dotted the landscape, their leaves glinting silver under the afternoon sun. The air still carried heat, but it no longer pressed down with the same punishing force as before. Ethan could feel the cub's energy returning with each step, its stride steadier, its breathing less strained. The cub no longer stumbled. Instead, it stayed close, brushing occasionally against Ethan's leg, as though reminding him of why they were there, why they could not stop. They crested a low hill where the ground opened into a narrow valley shaped by old erosion. A thin trickle of water wound through the valley floor, gleaming like a sliver of broken glass. Ethan felt his muscles ease at the sight. Water meant life, plants, prey, and more importantly, a cooler path forward. The cub trotted ahead, its nose twitching at the scent of water, but Ethan held out a hand to stop it. "Slow down," he whispered. "We don't know what's down there." Animals often gathered around scarce water sources, and not all of them were peaceful. Ethan scanned the valley carefully, noting the movement of a few doves in a nearby tree and the distant shapes of antelope grazing along a farther ridge. Nothing seemed out of place at first glance. They descended the hill cautiously, making their way toward the trickling stream. The cub leaned down to drink, small tongue lapping eagerly at the cool water. Ethan let it drink freely this time. The cub needed it. He cupped water in his hands, splashing it over his face and neck. The relief was immediate. For a moment, they both simply existed in the quiet, letting the tension ease. Ethan almost forgot the weight of urgency. Almost. But then he caught sight of something unusual farther down the valley. A patch of dust rising and falling in small bursts, like something struggling against the earth itself. The cub saw it too. Its tiny body stiffened, ears pointed sharply forward. Ethan narrowed his eyes. At first the shape was hard to distinguish through the haze of dust and shifting light. But then the outline resolved. Small, rounded, and definitely alive. A rhino calf. Its left hind leg was wedged deep between two fallen slabs of rock at the valley's edge. The calf strained helplessly, each movement sending up another puff of dust. Nearby, its mother, an adult female rhino, circled anxiously, her massive head lowering and lifting in distressed rhythm. She snorted, pawed at the ground, but every attempt to help only pushed more dirt into the cracks. Ethan froze. Rhino mothers were fiercely protective. One wrong move could turn him and the cub into unintended targets. He raised a hand to keep the cub behind him and watched the pair carefully. The mother let out a low, mournful grunt, nudging her calf with her horn in desperate attempts to free it. The baby squealed, its voice cracking with panic. The sound echoed through the valley, raw and helpless. The mother backed up a few steps, clearly torn between her instinct to help and her fear of hurting the calf more. Ethan glanced down at the cub. Its little face was tilted upward, eyes wide. Compassion flickered in the cub's gaze, an emotion he didn't expect from such a young animal. Ethan felt it too. He couldn't walk away. Not from this. Not after everything he had already seen today. He stepped forward slowly and whispered, "Stay here." The cub whimpered softly, but obeyed, settling into the grass with tense stillness. Ethan raised his hands to show he had no intention of harming anyone and walked toward the distressed rhino pair. The mother caught sight of him immediately. Her massive body stiffened, and she turned to face him head-on. Even from a distance, Ethan could feel the weight of her gaze. Her nostrils flared, considering him. One charge from her could crush him. Ethan stopped and lowered his voice to a calm murmur, the same tone he used when approaching wounded animals in the past. "I'm not here to hurt you," he said gently. "I want to help." The mother rhino snorted again, ears flicking back and forth. Ethan took a slow step forward, his heart pounding. He crouched slightly, making himself appear smaller, less threatening. The calf let out another desperate squeal, wriggling helplessly. The mother turned briefly toward her baby, torn between instinctive aggression and maternal fear. Ethan used that moment. He moved to the calf's side, careful not to make sudden motions. He examined the rocks, old erosion slabs, heavy but loose. The calf's leg was wedged deep into a narrow gap. Removing the rock might hurt it, but leaving it wasn't an option. Ethan assessed how the rocks leaned and judged the best angle to move them. He pulled off his outer shirt and wrapped it around his hands for better grip. Then he braced his shoulder against the rock and pushed with all the strength he had left. The rock refused at first, then shifted an inch. Sand cascaded down. The calf squealed again. Ethan paused. "It's okay. You're okay," he whispered, even though he was trembling. The mother took a few heavy steps toward him, snorting sharply in warning. Ethan froze, his breath caught. The mother hesitated, then backed away again, letting him continue. Somehow, she understood. Ethan repositioned, gripping a different angle, and pushed again. The rock finally gave way, rolling to the side with a dull thud. The calf's leg slipped free, and it immediately tried to stand. At first it wobbled, its little body shaking. But after a moment it managed to stabilize itself. The mother rushed forward and nudged her calf, circling it protectively. Ethan staggered back, sweat dripping from his brow. Relief washed over him like a cool breeze. The mother rhino looked at him again, this time with a strange stillness in her dark eyes. Not hostility, something deeper, a silent acknowledgement. Then she nudged her calf forward, guiding it away from the rocks. The cub hurried over to Ethan, pressing its warm body against his leg. Ethan rested a hand on its back, still catching his breath. The rhino mother paused once more before leaving the valley entirely. Her gaze lingered on Ethan and the cub, and then she turned away, leading her calf toward safer ground. Ethan exhaled slowly. "That could have gone very differently," he murmured, bending down to give the cub a reassuring stroke. "But I think..." She understood. They both watched the rhinos disappear into the distance. The valley felt different now, less hostile, more alive. Ethan hoisted his pack again and looked north, where the lioness's faint trail lay waiting. "Come on," he whispered. "We still have someone to find." The cub stepped forward confidently this time, renewed by rest, food, and the quiet strength of shared survival. Together, they left the valley behind, walking toward the next chapter of their uncertain journey, the afternoon sun casting long shadows at their backs. The land began to rise again, the soft valley floor giving way to harsher terrain littered with thorny brush and twisted roots. The air grew drier, thinner, carrying with it faint hints of dust and something else, something older, something unsettling. Ethan recognized the sensation immediately. It was the quiet before revelation, the hush before the truth broke open. The cub's steps slowed, its body tensed as though it could sense the shift too. It kept close to Ethan's leg, occasionally brushing against him as if for reassurance. They advanced through a rough corridor of scrub bushes. Their branches clawed at Ethan's clothes, snagged his pack straps, and scratched lightly against his arms. The cub pushed through easily, slipping between the narrow openings until the bushes suddenly parted. Ethan stepped out behind it and froze. Before them stretched a patch of ground unnaturally cleared of vegetation. The soil had been disturbed violently, kicked up in wide arcs that spoke of panic and confusion. Ethan knelt, pressing his palm into the dust. He recognized the scattering pattern. The lioness had been struggling here, fighting against whatever force had brought her down. His heart tightened as he traced the faint outline of her body in the dirt, the imprint still fresh enough to feel immediate. The cub walked ahead cautiously, nose to the ground. It stopped near a cluster of low thorn bushes, letting out a trembling sound Ethan had not heard before, a cry not of hunger, not of fear, but of mourning. Ethan rose slowly and approached the bushes. Something about their arrangement felt wrong. He crouched, parted a few branches, and felt his breath catch. There, hidden beneath a layer of carefully placed brush, was a pit. Its edges were smooth, carved deliberately by human hands. Thick thorns had been woven together to conceal it, and from the bottom of the pit rose a faint echo of silence. So deep it sent a chill up Ethan's spine. He rose and circled the pit's edge, pulling back more branches until the entire opening was exposed. It was at least twice his height, the sides steep and packed with dry earth. The bottom lay in shadow, the kind that swallowed light whole. The cub approached the rim and peered down, its small body trembling. It let out a grief-filled cry that pierced the quiet, a sound Ethan would never forget. Heart thundering, he stepped to the edge and looked down. At the bottom lay the lioness. Her body was stretched on its side, fur coated in dust, her breathing shallow, so shallow he almost didn't see it. A tranquilizer dart was lodged near her shoulder, its metallic tip glinting faintly in the dim light. Dried blood stained the fur around it. Her ribs rose and fell in irregular motions, each breath labored, fragile and far too slow. Ethan inhaled sharply. Oh no! She was alive, but barely. The pit wasn't a natural formation. It was a poacher's trap. Ethan had seen similar pits before, built to capture large animals silently and immobilize them until the poachers returned. But this one had been hastily abandoned. Maybe the lioness had proven too heavy. Maybe something had scared the poachers off. Whatever the reason, she had been left here, alone, dying. The cub's cries grew more frantic, its paws scraping at the dirt as if it could dig its way down to her own. Ethan knelt beside it, wrapping one arm around the cub's trembling body. Easy, he whispered. We'll help her, I promise. He scanned the area quickly. The pit's edges were steep, but manageable with proper support. Ethan unhooked the rope from his pack, a length he carried for equipment rigging and emergency climbs. He searched for a sturdy anchor point and found a thick acacia tree just a few feet from the pit's edge. Its roots twisted deep into the earth, solid and unmoving. Working quickly, he looped the rope around the tree's trunk, pulling tightly to test its hold. The rope held fast. Ethan unraveled the rest and tied it around his waist with practiced hands. The cub watched him with wide, frightened eyes, whimpering softly. Ethan placed a hand on its head. I'll be right back, he said, though the cub didn't understand the words, only the tone. He sat on the pit's edge and swung his legs over. Using his boots to brace against the dirt walls, he eased himself down, gripping the rope tightly. The descent wasn't easy. The walls crumbled slightly under his weight, sending small showers of dirt cascading down onto the lioness. She stirred weakly at the sound, but didn't rise. When his boots finally touched the bottom, he knelt immediately beside her. The lioness tried to lift her head, but her strength failed. Ethan spoke softly, letting his voice settle into the quiet. Easy, girl. I'm here to help you. He checked her breathing, placing a steady hand near her ribs. Her heartbeat was faint. She was dehydrated, tranquilized, and dangerously weak. Ethan reached for his canteen, uncapped it, and poured a small amount of water into his palm. He brought it to her muzzle, allowing drops to touch her tongue. The lioness responded faintly, licking the moisture before settling again. He repeated the process slowly, careful not to overwhelm her. The cub's alive, he murmured. He led me here. He didn't give up on you. The lioness's eyes flickered open, faintly recognizing his tone, not as a threat, but as a presence offering help. Ethan continued to offer water, drop by drop, until her breathing steadied enough to deepen slightly. But she was still far from safe. She needed medical attention. She needed rescue teams. She needed time they didn't have. He tightened the rope around his waist again and prepared to climb back up to the surface to call for help. Before ascending, he glanced once more at the lioness, lying frail and silent at the bottom of the cruel pit. We're not leaving you here, he whispered. He braced his boots against the wall and began climbing. Dirt slid beneath his feet, but the rope held. As he lifted himself higher, he saw the cub waiting anxiously at the rim, paws stretched forward as if reaching for him. Step by slow step, Ethan climbed until he finally rolled over the edge, breathing hard. The cub ran to him, pawing at his chest, eyes pleading. Ethan rested a hand on its back. "She's alive," he said softly. "But we need help." As he reached for his radio, trying once again to get a signal, the savanna wind stirred the thorn bushes around them. The world felt painfully still, too still. Something had happened here, and something else was about to. Ethan tightened his grip on the radio, holding it high as he moved across the clearing in search of a better signal. Static cracked, sputtered, then fell silent again. He tried a different angle. Nothing. The cub hovered beside him, circling anxiously, its small claws brushing the soil with restless scratches. The wind had shifted, carrying with it a faint rustling sound from beyond the thorn bushes. Ethan stilled. The cub's ears perked sharply, its tiny body stiffening like a drawn bowstring. A chill crept up Ethan's spine. Something was watching them. Placing the radio against his belt again, he crouched beside the cub and gently touched its back. "Stay close," he whispered. The cub pressed against his leg, trembling. Ethan scanned the brush, eyes narrowing as the rustling grew louder, more deliberate. Too heavy for a bird, too light for a buffalo, too quick to be wind. He rose slowly, his pulse drumming in his ears. A shadow appeared at the edge of the clearing, then another, and another. Painted wolves. 3 stepped out first, their mottled coats blending nearly perfectly with the dusty backdrop. Their amber eyes gleamed with focused intensity. Wild dogs traveled in packs, hunted in packs, survived in packs, and they knew when prey was weak. The scent of blood from the pit, from the lioness, from the struggle had brought them here. Ethan felt the cub press tighter against his boot, its tiny body shaking. He moved instinctively, positioning himself between the cub and the encroaching predators. He raised his arms slightly, making himself look larger, though he knew it wouldn't be enough against a coordinated pack. Painted wolves didn't fear much. Their confidence came from numbers, from unity. 2 more wolves emerged, completing the semicircle around the clearing. Their low growls rumbled through the air like distant thunder. Ethan took a step back, pressing himself closer to the pit. If they lunged, he had nowhere to run, not without abandoning the cub, which he refused to do. The wolves advanced, paws silent on the loose soil, their jaws parting slightly in anticipation. The cub gave a small, frightened cry. Instinctively, Ethan knelt and scooped the little lion into his arms. The wolves reacted instantly, their muscles rippled, their ears pivoted forward, and their eyes sharpened. They recognized movement, vulnerability, opportunity. Ethan's breath caught. He had to think, had to act, but the pack was already closing in. The wolves approached the pit's edge now, drawn deeper by the lioness's scent. One wolf sniffed the air and let out a sharp bark, signaling to the others. The pack began to shift formation, tightening their semicircle into a narrowing cone that funneled toward Ethan and the cub. Every instinct in Ethan screamed at him to run, but there was no safe direction. He backed up against the acacia tree, the cub quivering in his arms. "It's okay," he whispered, more to steady himself than the lion. "I've got you." The wolves inched closer. A low, guttural growl rose from the leader, a sleek, scar-faced wolf with golden eyes. It lowered its head, hackles raised, preparing to charge. Ethan held his ground, heart hammering against his ribs. A sudden crack of a twig snapped the tension. Ethan jerked his head to the side. Another wolf had emerged, this one approaching from behind, cutting off their last possible escape. The cub whimpered and buried its face in Ethan's arm. They were surrounded. Ethan's mind raced. He needed to create distance, confusion, something to break the pack's coordination. He scanned the ground desperately. His field bag lay only a few feet away, knocked down when he had rushed to the pit earlier. If he could reach it, even briefly, he might have a chance. Inside that pack were a few tools, nothing lethal, but enough to distract a wild dog. But the wolves sensed the shift in Ethan's gaze. The scar-faced leader snarled and took another step forward. "Easy," Ethan murmured, though his voice carried none of the calm he tried to project. He shifted his grip on the cub and reached slowly into his pocket. His fingers closed around the metal cylinder he kept for emergency signaling, a small smoke canister. Not a flare, not fire, but smoke and noise. It might buy him seconds, maybe less. He held the canister low, shielding it with his body so the wolves wouldn't notice. The scar-faced leader bared its teeth. Ethan's thumb pressed the trigger. A sharp hiss exploded from the canister, releasing a plume of dense white smoke and a crackling sound loud enough to jolt the pack into sudden confusion. The dogs yelped, startled. Some backed up, others veered sideways, their formations broken. Ethan seized the moment. He scooped the cub tighter against his chest and sprinted toward the pit's rim, keeping low to avoid blocking the rising smoke. The wolves regained their senses quickly, barking and lunging through the thinning haze. Ethan reached the pit's rope anchor just as one of the wolves snapped at his heel. He jerked away, heart slamming against his ribs. The wolf snarled, preparing for another attack, but the smoke had disrupted their confidence. The cub twisted in his grip, eyes wide with fear. Ethan moved backward, trying to put the acacia tree between himself and the wolves. The scar-faced leader approached again, more cautiously this time, analyzing Ethan's stance, the cub's weakness, and the shifting odds. Ethan could feel the wolves regaining coherence. The smoke was fading. Their snarls grew more synchronized. Their stances lowered into unified hunting posture. His mind raced. He needed another distraction, another few seconds, anything. But then the cub did something Ethan never expected. It slipped out of his arms and planted its tiny paws firmly on the ground in front of him. Its body trembled violently, but it stood between Ethan and the wolves. The cub let out a small, broken sound at first, barely louder than a whisper. Then it inhaled sharply, lifted its head, and released a roar. It wasn't much. It wasn't powerful. It wasn't even fully formed, but it carried a fierce, raw defiance that startled even the wolves. The pack hesitated. Ethan's breath caught. He reached for the cub again, but the little lion wouldn't move. Its tail bristled, its stance widened, its tiny chest trembling with every breath. It wasn't strength, it was love. Pure, unfiltered instinct. The cub would not let anything hurt him. The scar-faced leader let out an uncertain growl, clearly confused by the cub's sudden show of courage. The rest of the pack responded with low, hesitant murmurs. The unity of their attack fractured once more. Ethan seized the opportunity. He snatched the cub back into his arms, grabbed the nearest rock, and hurled it with all his strength at the open ground between him and the wolves. It struck the earth with a loud crack. The dogs jumped back instinctively. "That's enough!" Ethan shouted, his voice booming with everything he had left. The pack faltered again, shaken, uncertain. Ethan backed toward the pit's edge, keeping his eyes on the wolves, the cub clinging to him with every ounce of its strength. The pack didn't retreat entirely, but they stopped advancing. For now. The smoke drifted into the sky in thin wisps. The clearing grew quiet again, the tension settling like dust on dry ground. Ethan's chest heaved as he surveyed the pack, now lingering at a distance, watching, debating whether the fight was worth it. The scar-faced leader took one last step forward, then stopped. Something held it back. Something Ethan couldn't see or hear, but felt in the air. A shift, subtle yet unmistakable. The wolves slowly backed away, melting into the brush one by one. Only when the last tail disappeared did Ethan allow himself to breathe. He sank to one knee, holding the cub close. "It's okay," he whispered shakily. "You were brave, braver than me." His voice trembled, but there was no time to rest. The lioness in the pit was still dying, and Ethan knew the danger wasn't over, not by a long shot. The clearing had fallen silent again, but it wasn't the peaceful kind of silence. It was the breathless, heavy quiet that comes only after fear has swept through a place and settled deep in the soil. Ethan held the cub against his chest for a moment longer, letting both their heartbeats slow. Sweat dripped down his temples, and the lingering scent of dust and smoke clung to the air. The wolves were gone for now, but he knew they could return the second hunger tugged at their instincts again. He couldn't afford to lose time. Ethan placed the cub gently on the ground. "Stay close," he said, voice still slightly unsteady. The cub pressed against his leg, refusing to leave his side. Ethan crossed the clearing and reached the rope secured to the acacia tree. The knot held firm. He tested it twice, tugging sharply. Good. It would support both the lioness and the weight of whoever needed to climb. He tried his radio again. "Field Unit Walker to base. Emergency. Do you copy?" Static. Then silence. The same dead quiet that now felt like another enemy. He lowered the radio. Someone would eventually pick up the signal, but the lioness didn't have that kind of time. He had to stabilize her. He had to buy those precious minutes she needed. He braced himself, tied the rope around his waist again, and prepared to descend one more time. The cub followed him to the rim, whining softly. Ethan stroked its head with a trembling hand. "I won't be long. Watch the top for me. If those wolves come back..." He didn't finish the sentence. The cub seemed to understand anyway. He lowered himself into the pit. Dirt crumbled beneath his boots as he slid downward, gripping the rope tightly. He reached the bottom and dropped to his knees beside the lioness. Her breaths came shallow and sporadic, her ribs barely lifting. Her eyes fluttered weakly, recognizing movement but unable to respond fully. Ethan unscrewed the cap of his canteen and poured another small stream of water into his hand. He lifted the lioness's head carefully and let the droplets fall against her tongue. She licked at them slowly. He repeated the process, then checked the tranquilizer dart. It had been inserted deeply, likely from a close-range shot. The dosage must have been heavy, intentionally so. "You've been through hell," Ethan whispered. "But you're not alone." He glanced around the pit for anything else that might help. Nothing but dirt, roots, and the harsh smell of fear. He reached into his pack and retrieved a small thermal blanket. It wasn't much, but keeping her warm could help fight shock. He draped it gently over her body, pressing it down near her shoulders. Above him, dust trickled from the rim. Ethan snapped his head upward. The cub was pacing nervously, moving from one side of the opening to the other. Its ears flattened. Its body tensed. Something had unsettled it. Ethan's breath tightened. "No, not again." Another soft shower of dirt. A faint rustling. The wolves were returning. Ethan scrambled to the rope and began climbing, his muscles burning from exertion. He pushed his boots against the wall, pulled hard with his arms, heart pounding as he ascended. His hands slipped once, dirt scraped his palms. He gritted his teeth and pulled again. He reached the rim just as the cub let out a sharp cry. Not far from them, the first wolf stepped out of the brush, the scar-faced leader. Its ears pricked forward, its body taut with focus, its amber eyes locked straight on the cub. The rest of the pack fanned out behind it in practiced formation. Ethan quickly moved in front of the cub, shielding it with his body. He reached into his pack for another canister, but his heart sank. He only had one. The wolves advanced slowly, deliberately, no longer startled by his presence or the smoke they had already endured. Their confidence had returned, their hunger too. Ethan stepped backward, feeling the ground shift slightly under his boot. The pit was behind him, too close. If he wasn't careful, he could fall. He tightened his stance and held the cub behind his leg. The scar-faced leader lifted its head, sniffed the air, then let out a low, rattling growl that pulsed through the clearing like a warning drumbeat. The wolves began to circle. Ethan scanned the ground for anything, rocks, sticks, anything he could use. His eyes landed on a long, half-buried tree root. He reached down and tugged it free. It wasn't a weapon. Not against a pack like this. But it was something. The leader stepped forward, jaws parting. The cub whimpered, burying its face against Ethan's calf. Ethan steadied himself. "You're not getting past me," he said under his breath. The wolves crept closer. The leader crouched, preparing to lunge. Ethan gripped the root with white-knuckled desperation. Then everything froze. The cub stepped forward. It moved out from behind Ethan, standing squarely between him and the wolves. Its tiny body shook, its tail bristling. Ethan reached for it, whispering, "No, no, stay back." But the cub wouldn't be moved. It looked the leader dead in the eyes. And then it inhaled. The cub's first roar broke across the clearing like a fragile, newborn thunder. It wasn't loud. It wasn't powerful. But something about it carried a raw, unfiltered courage that made even the hardened, scar-faced wolf pause. The cub roared again, its voice cracking and trembling, but full of desperate love, as if shouting the only thing it knew. "I'm not afraid of you." The wolves hesitated. Their unified stance faltered. The leader tilted its head, confused. Its growl softened for a moment, not because it feared the cub's strength, but because it didn't understand the cub's bravery. Ethan felt the shift like a gust of air across his skin. He grabbed the cub again, clutching it to his chest. "It's okay," he whispered, voice thick with emotion. "You did enough." With his free hand, Ethan waved the root wildly in front of him, stepping forward with sudden force. "Back!" he shouted. The wolves jerked, startled by the sudden aggression. Several stepped backward. The leader snarled, but did not advance. It watched Ethan with a conflicted expression, a predator weighing an uncertain risk. Finally, the leader let out a short, sharp bark. The pack froze. The scar-faced wolf lifted its head, sniffed the air again, then turned abruptly and trotted back into the brush. The others followed, one by one, fading into the trees like ghosts. The clearing fell silent once more. Ethan collapsed to his knees, still holding the cub, his breath shaking uncontrollably. Tears stung the corners of his eyes, not from fear, but from the overwhelming weight of what the cub had just done. "You little miracle," he whispered into its fur. "You have more courage than any creature I've ever met." The cub nestled into his chest, trembling but alive. Ethan lifted his eyes toward the pit, where the lioness still struggled to cling to life. The wolves were gone, but the race against time had only just begun. Ethan rose shakily to his feet, still clutching the cub against his chest. His arms felt weak, his breath unsteady. But there was no room for rest. Not with the lioness lying at the bottom of that pit, her life fading a little more with every passing minute. The cub sensed Ethan's urgency. It pressed close to him, tiny paws kneading at his shirt, as if urging him onward. "We have to move," Ethan whispered. "Your mom's waiting." He set the cub gently on the ground and grabbed the rope again, checking the knot with trembling hands. It was still secure. He wiped the sweat from his brow, steadied his breath, and began lowering himself back into the pit. The cub peeked over the edge anxiously, letting out soft whines that echoed faintly off the dirt walls. Ethan reached the bottom and knelt beside the lioness. Her breathing was weaker than before, thin, uneven. Her chest rose slowly, then stalled for an unbearably long second before lifting again. Ethan swallowed hard. Her body was cold beneath his fingertips. The tranquilizer was still working through her system, fighting against what little strength she had left. "I'm here," he murmured, trying to keep his voice calm. "Stay with me. Please stay with me." He pulled a small medical pouch from his pack. It wasn't much, but it carried supplies for field emergencies: gauze, disinfectant, electrolyte powder, glucose gel for collapsed animals, all meant for temporary stabilization, not for saving a lioness near death. But he had no choice. He tore open a packet of electrolyte solution and mixed it with the last of his water, swirling it until it dissolved. Ethan lifted the lioness's head slightly and dribbled the mixture into her mouth. At first, it rolled off her tongue, but after a few seconds she weakly licked, swallowing just enough to give him a sliver of hope. He repeated the process, little by little. Each swallow was a victory. Each flick of her tongue was a promise that she hadn't given up. "You're a fighter," he whispered, "and your cub. He's stronger than he knows." The lioness's ears twitched faintly at the mention of her cub. Ethan placed a hand over her shoulder, feeling the faint pulse beneath her skin. It was slow, but still there. She wasn't gone yet. A tiny shower of dirt trickled down the wall again. Ethan glanced up. The cub was pacing along the rim, whining anxiously, its small face peering down. It circled the pit several times before sitting near the edge, paws dangling into empty air as if longing to leap in beside them. Ethan smiled sadly. "You're doing your part," he told it softly. "Just stay up there. That's how you help." He reached again for the lioness, placing one hand over her ribcage. He counted the seconds between breaths. Too long, too shallow. He needed to stimulate her breathing. Ethan shifted positions and pressed down gently on her chest, rhythmic pressure to coax her lungs into action. He had done chest stimulation before on sedated animals, but never on an adult lioness fighting for her life at the bottom of a poacher's trap. "Come on," he murmured. "Breathe." He pressed again, and again. For a moment, nothing happened. Then her chest lifted just a little more than before. A deeper breath. A small triumph. Ethan exhaled shakily. He continued the stabilization, keeping her warm with the thermal blanket, monitoring her breathing, giving tiny sips of the electrolyte mixture. Minutes passed like hours. Sweat beaded on his forehead. His hands ached. His voice cracked as he spoke constantly, quietly, keeping her anchored to the world. Above them, the sky was beginning to change. The sun had dipped slightly, bringing a cooler light across the savanna. The shadows around the pit deepened, stretching long fingers across the dirt. Ethan glanced upward, praying for a miracle, for the radio to miraculously catch a signal, for someone to pass nearby, for anything that could bridge the distance between survival and loss. He lifted the radio again. "Field Unit Walker to base," he said, voice low but firm. "Emergency situation. Adult lioness critically injured. Request immediate response. I repeat, immediate response." He released the button. Only static replied. He tried again and again. The cub whimpered from above and scratched at the dirt with its tiny paws, sending a few small stones tumbling into the pit. Ethan looked at it and sighed. I know. I'm trying." He knelt beside the lioness again, checking her pulse. Slower. He felt panic rising in his chest, but he flattened it down with sheer will. "Don't leave him," he whispered. "He needs you. Just hold on, please." He positioned himself beside her head, stroking her cheek gently. Her eyes fluttered open for the briefest second. Just a sliver. Enough for Ethan to see her gold-lit gaze flick toward him, not as an enemy, but as a presence holding her up when her body wanted to give out. "You're not alone," Ethan whispered. "We're right here." Another breath. Barely there. But real. He leaned closer, studying her chest. The rise and fall was slowing again. Dangerously so. He needed to act fast. He repositioned himself and began chest stimulation again. Slow, steady, rhythmic. His hands pressed firmly against her side, coaxing each breath, urging her lungs to work through the fog of tranquilizer and exhaustion. "Come on," he said again, voice cracking. "Stay with me." Each push sent a ripple of dust across the pit floor. His arms trembled from exertion. His back ached. But he didn't stop. Couldn't stop, not until he heard something. A faint hum in the distance. Ethan froze. He looked up sharply. The cub heard it too. It sprang to its feet at the rim, tail high, ears pricked. It let out an excited chirp-like sound, pacing wildly from one edge of the pit to the other. Ethan stood, eyes glued to the sky visible through the jagged opening above. The hum grew louder, steadier, more mechanical. A rotor, a helicopter. Ethan's breath left him in a rush, almost a sob. Rescue was coming. Against every odd, every obstruction, every moment of fear, they were coming. He grabbed the radio again and shouted into it. "Here! I'm here! Lioness in critical condition! Send medics down immediately!" The cub let out a small roaring cry toward the sky, as if calling the team home itself. Ethan looked down at the lioness, her breathing barely there. "Hold on," he whispered, placing a steady hand over her heart. "They're coming. Just a few more minutes. Stay with me. Stay with him." Above them, the roar of the helicopter filled the savanna. Help, finally, was on the way. The sound grew louder as the aircraft swept over the treetops and circled the clearing. Dust spiraled into the air, whipping around Ethan and the cub in gritty swirls. The cub lowered itself instinctively, pressing against Ethan's leg as the helicopter hovered, angling for a safe landing spot. Ethan shielded the cub with his arm, squinting against the downdraft as he looked up. The helicopter banked slowly, then descended onto a patch of relatively level ground several yards away. The rotors sent a gale through the clearing, rattling branches and kicking up a storm of debris. As soon as the skids touched the earth, 2 rescue rangers jumped out, one carrying a medical kit, the other hauling a coil of heavy rope. Both wore protective gear and the calm expressions of people who had seen emergencies 1,000 times, yet treated each one as if it were the first. "Walker!" the lead ranger shouted over the din. "Where's the lioness?" "In the pit," Ethan called back, pointing urgently. "She's critical. Tranquilizer dart, dehydration, severe weakness." The ranger nodded sharply. "Show me." Ethan guided them to the pit's edge. The cub followed closely, whining and pacing. One ranger knelt and peered down, whistling under his breath at the sight. "She's in bad shape," he muttered. "We need to work fast." The medical ranger pulled open the kit and prepared a sedative counteragent. "We'll have to lower someone down," he said. "Stabilize her enough to hoist her up safely." Ethan stepped forward instantly. "I'll go." The ranger hesitated. "You've already been down once?" "Twice," Ethan answered. "She knows my presence. If you send someone else, she might panic, even weak as she is." The ranger studied him briefly, then nodded. "All right. But we'll secure you properly this time." They fastened a harness around Ethan's torso, checking each strap and carabiner with practiced precision. The rope was thicker and stronger than the one Ethan had used earlier. As they worked, the helicopter's rotors slowed to a gentler churn, leaving only a deep thrum in the background. The cub watched the entire process, eyes flicking between Ethan and the pit with visible anxiety. Ethan knelt beside the cub, stroking its tiny head. "I'm going to get your mom out," he murmured. "Stay up here with the team." The cub pressed its forehead against his knee, a small gesture that felt impossibly heavy with trust. Ethan swallowed hard and stepped toward the pit. With the ranger's help, he descended again. The harness held firm, the rope steady as he lowered himself down the dirt wall. He reached the bottom and immediately crouched beside the lioness. She lay exactly where he'd left her, her breaths faint but steady thanks to his earlier efforts. "She's still with us," Ethan said, projecting his voice upward. The medical ranger leaned over the pit. "I'm lowering down the antitoxin and hydration line. Keep her head elevated once I hand it off." Ethan positioned himself carefully, and received the supplies as they came down. He injected the antitoxin into the muscle of the lioness's shoulder, whispering softly, "Easy now. This will help." He then connected the hydration line, slowly administering fluid. The lioness stirred, just barely, but it was a response. "She's reacting," Ethan said, hope threading through his voice. Above him, the rangers exchanged quick glances. "Good. We need enough stabilization to lift her." Minutes passed, slow, steady, deliberate. The lioness's breaths began to deepen. Her pulse, though still weak, grew more regular. Her ears twitched faintly at the sounds above. The cub's cries could be heard from the rim, little whimpers echoing softly into the pit. "She's ready," the medical ranger finally said. "Let's get the harness around her." Ethan maneuvered the thick rescue straps under the lioness's torso, lifting her gently, inch by inch. His muscles ached, his hands scraped raw, but he didn't stop until the straps were secured. He checked them twice, then gave a thumbs up. "Pull her up!" The rangers began to hoist the lioness, slowly and with extreme care. Her body lifted off the ground, dangling only a few inches at first, before rising steadily. Ethan watched with bated breath, his heart thudding painfully as she moved up the side of the pit. Dirt tumbled from her weight, but the rope held strong. The cub's crying intensified the moment it saw its mother being lifted. Halfway up, the lioness's paw twitched. Her golden eyes fluttered open slightly, just for a moment, as if recognizing her child's voice. The cub scrambled at the edge of the pit, eager beyond containment. Ethan felt a surge of emotion swell in his chest. "Almost there," one ranger called. The lioness was carefully guided over the rim and laid onto a tarp beside the medical kit. The cub rushed to her, its tiny body pressing against her face. The lioness let out a faint breath, something like a sigh, as the cub nudged her cheek. When Ethan climbed out moments later, his legs nearly buckled. Relief washed over him in a wave so strong it stole the strength from his knees. The rangers caught him, steadying him before he could fall. "You did good, Walker," the lead ranger said. "Without your efforts, she wouldn't have lasted." Ethan shook his head, still breathing hard. "Her cub led me to her. He's the real hero." The cub crawled over to Ethan then, brushing its body against his leg before returning to its mother's side. The lioness lay still, but her breathing was more stable now, enough for transport, enough for hope. "We're loading them into the helicopter," the medic said. "Both mother and cub. We'll get them to the rehabilitation center. They've got better equipment there." Ethan nodded, wiping the sweat and dust from his forehead. "I'll go with them." As the rangers worked to prepare the stretcher, the lioness's tail gave the faintest twitch. Her eyes opened for a second, just long enough to meet Ethan's. In that brief moment, gratitude shone through the haze of sedation. A silent thank you from a creature who could not speak, yet understood everything that mattered. Ethan lowered his gaze, humbled. They lifted mother and cub onto the helicopter, securing them carefully. Ethan climbed in behind them, gripping the safety bar as the rotors began to spin harder. Dust swirled once more, rising like a cloud of memory around them. The helicopter lifted into the sky, leaving the pit and the danger behind. For the first time since this journey began, Ethan felt something powerful settle in his chest. Relief. And something deeper. Something like faith. They were finally headed toward safety, toward healing, toward the ending this small, brave cub had fought so fiercely for. 6 weeks passed in a rhythm of quiet labor, careful treatment, and the tender patience only those who work with broken creatures truly understand. At the Namibia Wildlife Rehabilitation Center, Ethan visited every week, at first because he needed reassurance the lioness would survive, and later because he realized the visits had become something he couldn't go without. The cub always knew when Ethan arrived. Even before he stepped through the metal gate, He would hear the patter of small paws racing across the holding enclosure, a soft thump against the fence, and an eager, breathy chirp that had somehow become the cub's signature greeting. The lioness healed slowly, but she healed. The tranquilizer had taken a toll on her, and dehydration had pushed her to the edge. But the steady drip of fluids, the careful diet, and constant monitoring brought color back to her eyes and strength back to her limbs. She had scars, inside and out, but they didn't dim the quiet resilience in the way she watched her cub or the way she followed Ethan with her gaze each time he approached. Ethan stood outside their enclosure now, watching mother and cub lying together in the golden straw. The afternoon sun warmed the metal roof, casting a soft glow across the pair. The cub lifted its head when it noticed him, its eyes brightening like sunrise breaking across the plains. It bounded toward him, pressing its tiny paws through the fence, tail flicking with joy. Ethan crouched down, letting the cub rub its face against his hand through the wire. "You're getting big," he whispered with a smile. "Not so little anymore." Behind them, the lioness rose slowly to her feet. She stepped into the sunbeam, muscles moving with fluid strength restored by weeks of care. Her eyes were clear now, steady, aware, and she watched Ethan with a calm that felt like recognition, like remembering the man who had climbed into a cold, dark pit and refused to let her life slip away. A soft rustle of footsteps approached from behind. Ranger Collins, the lead medic, stood beside Ethan with a clipboard. "She's good," he said quietly. "Really good. Stronger every day. And the cub's as healthy as any youngster his age." Ethan nodded, his eyes still on them. "So it's time." Collins gave a slow smile. "It's time. They're ready to go home." The word home lingered in the air, warm and heavy with meaning. The next morning, the release team gathered before sunrise. The land was quiet, a vast expanse of pale grass shimmering beneath the early dawn. The horizon blushed soft pink, painting the world with a promise of new beginnings. Ethan stood near the rear of the transport jeep where a large crate rested, its door secured with reinforced latches. Inside, the lioness waited calmly, her cub pressing against her side, both of them gazing out through the slats with silent curiosity. Ethan felt his chest swell with emotion he didn't entirely understand: gratitude, relief, and something like pride. They had survived impossible odds together, and now he had to let them go. Ranger Collins approached and handed him the release lever. "You found them," he said. "It's only right you do the honors." Ethan swallowed and nodded. He stepped forward slowly, the dry grass brushing against his boots. The air was cool, the sky wide and endless above. He could hear the soft breath of the lioness inside the crate, steady and strong, the rhythm of a life reclaimed. He gripped the lever. The crate door swung open with a soft metallic click. For a moment, nothing happened. Then the lioness stepped out. Slow, deliberate. Her paws sinking into the soil she had nearly never returned to. She lifted her head, closing her eyes to feel the sun warm her face. Her cub darted out after her, immediately bounding around in excited loops, tail flicking as it explored the open world like it was greeting an old friend. Ethan stood still, barely breathing. The lioness turned toward him. She walked forward, silent, graceful, and stopped just inches from him. Slowly, gently, she pressed her forehead against his shoulder. The weight of her touch sent a surge of warmth through his chest, a quiet, powerful gesture of respect more honest than any spoken word. Ethan's eyes stung. He lifted a hand and rested it lightly against her mane. "You're welcome," he whispered. "You're safe now. Go on." The lioness stepped back. The cub hurried to her side. But before following its mother, it turned once more toward Ethan. It rose onto its hind legs, small paws resting against his thigh, just as it had on the very first day, on that dusty road where everything began. But this time the cub wasn't begging for help. It was saying goodbye. Ethan knelt and rested his hand against the cub's head. "Take care of her," he murmured. "You're stronger than you know." The cub nuzzled his palm, then dropped down and bounded after its mother. Ethan stood and watched as mother and cub walked across the golden grasslands. Their silhouettes moved with quiet purpose, weaving between tall grasses and scattered acacia trees. The lioness paused at a distant rise, looking back once, as if memorizing the man who had walked beside her child through danger, fear, and darkness. Then she turned and continued forward. The cub glanced back several times, each look a soft echo of everything they had shared. And finally, they disappeared beyond the low ridge, swallowed gently by the wilderness that had been waiting for them all along. Ethan stayed there for a long time, the breeze stirring around him, carrying the faint scent of sun-warmed grass. He felt no sadness, only a deep, peaceful ache that came from witnessing something rare and beautiful. The journey was over, but its memory would follow him forever. If this story touched your heart even a little, let me know by dropping a simple 1 in the comments. Just one number. That's all it takes to show you're still here, still feeling this journey with us. And if you'd love to see more stories like this, don't forget to subscribe and stay close. There are many more incredible moments from the wild waiting for you. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next story.